guess a really quick response, hopefully it's quick, to some of this. I was going to comment on some of the discussions going on pertaining to topics of the story of Esther and Haman that are online. And I guess basically the summary of the story of Esther and Haman is it happens after the fact, after the divided kingdoms of Israel. And there's still lingering tensions between those from the different sides and factions. And so at the time of Esther, the certain groups from the different sides had already been absorbed into other kingdoms and whatnot. And one of the groups that from the remnant tribe, among various ones that were involved in some of the different provinces and whatnot. Let's see how to summarize it. Like basically, they kind of, so these tensions that developed between the sides still lingered in between the groups, still having to negotiate unto whatever like the occupying forces or dominating forces were, or whatever the world power was. And so in this story, you find that like under Xerxes, there's these tensions developing between some of Jewish groups or Hebrew groups and some of those that are still within the lingering effects of these like unresolved tensions and whatnot. And so one of the characters on like the oppositional side sees this guy Mordecai not like basically kind of practicing in like a certain obedience to like Judaism and not bowing down to the like when the king comes through and just other protocols that would portray full allegiance to the kings and whatnot. And there's a variety of other things too. So basically he kind of sees it as this opportunity to out him and kind of like let the leadership know like, hey, he's not actually really compliant to, you know, like your allegiance and whatnot. And so it becomes what they call like the plot of Haman. And so he then kind of conspires this plan to like set himself up and develop this connection among the administration and leadership, and then do away with this like these rivals, the opposition, because there's this sense of it developing within the area under this type of dominion. And so you see that he's negotiating through the leadership and maybe potentially trying to strategize setting up influence in that type of way. Mordecai then goes and there's other things happening too. It's this sense where people can kind of understand that there's this growing tension. They already know, so it wouldn't be like like a surprise to then say, hey, guess what, there's this growing tension among different factions and whatnot. They know. And so it just kind of like zeroes in on this story of a version of the different sides. So this guy internally, using the mechanisms of the like political dynamic, is trying to set this tension against one of their opposition. And it kind of comes across as like this is an example of a stage of somebody trying to preserve in the midst of what they find themselves in. They're trying to preserve a distinction unto God in the midst of this dominion. And so we kind of get the story, like the gist of the story is like, how can this continuing like commitment to God in the midst of this type of situation persevere through? So that's kind of like some of the story. So Mordecai then talks with Esther, which is like a young woman in his care. I think he's like the uncle or something. And he kind of introduces to her, like our people are developing this tension. There's these different factions, and we're going to, like, it's like functioning through the leadership. Like the tensions that are befalling the people are functioning through the leadership. And so it's kind of this strategy to situate her in a position to speak to the king in favor, to request favor for the people. And on the other side of things are happening within his administration, and he is involved in, so you kind of get this picture that he, like a lot of kings in those times, are involved in the politics of the day, the social pressure, the dynamics, the whining and dining. So he's at this dinner banquet, and you get the picture that a lot of the movers and shakers and the politicians and those that help the system function the way it is are there. And he's like having drinks and getting carried away or what have you. And then in that setting, then somebody calls for him to say, hey, why don't you bring out your wife and do all of this, da 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 da. And so you get this picture, like the setting is that there's this like certain social pressure. So you also, what you find from that is that just like a lot of times, like there's never really a story where a king, like what you find in a lot of these scriptures, like the behind the scenes social pressure is that the kings are never really fully in power. They are trapped in these like strategic mechanisms of things. And so he kind of gets himself stuck in this pressure, this social pressure. And in this kind of stupor that he finds himself in, he ends up kind of getting cornered in this pressure, and calls to have his wife come out, and then she resists because it's like a situation, like she doesn't want to be involved in that situation. And anyway, she resists and doesn't want to come out, and it just intensifies this pressure. Anyway, long story short, he's kind of put in a position where he has to either force her to do it or send her away. And that's even a reflection of kind of like these strange dynamics that you're finding in their negotiation. So it almost even gets this picture as to like, a functioning system wouldn't really, like the people wouldn't intentionally put their leader in that type of position, right? And so you also, what you get there is like you get this picture of there's other types of pressure points against the king, like situated in place. But anyway, he's forced to send her away just because to like preserve this like certain appearance of things. There's like an even further question though as to like what types of pressure points, because if a king had power, he obviously has power, he should be able to like do away with different ones. But these people then must have had another type of functional power against him, because he can't inflict like isolated pressure against them. He's stuck in this little social web of this power construct, and so he's it forces him to have to like send her away. So he sends her away, and then eventually, what I think this is actually the setting first. So like prior to the uncle going and speaking to Esther, I think how it goes, I'm just rambling here, that happens, and it sets the stage for eventually then they're seeking for a maiden or someone to fill that position. And so then that's when Mordecai goes and talks to Esther, like, would you, like, if she would be willing to participate in this, to have like access to the king, and then help to develop better relationships within in the kingdom and whatnot, in favor of relieving the tension that's developing. And so basically she does, and eventually she gets into that position. There's all these different stages of that. And it just so happens that at the time, this Haman character is like plotting all of these things like against them. And so this story kind of like gets ahead of it, where it basically situates her in a position. It's a vulnerable strategy. And then once she's situated with favor with the king, then she's able to eventually then like let him know that this character Haman is plotting like these certain actions against like her uncle. And not only that, eventually then, because there's this other situation where he's able to help support the king, then Esther and Mordecai are positioned then to be able to negotiate on behalf of like creating better conditions and situations within the kingdom. And then Haman, then this guy that's like plotting against them, is then sentenced to have what he had tried to afflict on Mordecai is then what his sentence is and happens to him. And so one of the main points of that is this story of how this kind of like, so like you see throughout scripture, is that this little portion of preserving this path of God in the midst of difficult world relations is what overcomes and is like succeeds. But it's through very difficult, vulnerable negotiations where people's lives are at stake and whatnot. And so if you just read it like that and you see it as like perseverance of that, you can see like, oh, the like life application is that even in the midst of difficulties and all these mounting pressures to be immoral or to go against like your spiritual growth, it's this story that reminds you like triumphant of that doing the right thing or staying in line with your integrity in the midst of these difficulties can be successful. But you have to like engage in like like developing and continuing to like cultivate those types of like outcomes and whatnot. That could be like a really simple application, that it still costs you though to have certain disciplines to like preserve that for your life. And it also, but there's other applications too, you know, that just going into the default of the pressure on the people to adhere to the kingdom isn't really a useful vision in the long run, because you can see that even the king didn't really seem free. There were other forces in the administration against him, and that ultimately he couldn't even himself abide within, because eventually then he also like longs for, in like he has like a like he misses having his partner there, and then that's when they develop this like looking for another person, you know, to replace them. And so you see that he doesn't even seem as free to make various choices, because the way that kingdoms work is that it puts various types of pressure, improper types of power structure type pressures on leaders, and so they're not even really free. And so forcing the citizens to comply, even if people say just comply, you also see like downriver from that just doesn't work either, because ultimately not even the king nor the leaders or the social pressures produce freedom. So there isn't really freedom. We also see in the story is the only little inclination of freedom is through like Mordecai and Esther on behalf of the people, like freeing them. And ultimately it was like Mordecai. He was the one seeking for like this little like glimmer of spiritual freedom, because he was pushing against the direction that everything else was going. And then it's like an overcoming story as to like continue planting that seed of transformation of the systems and whatnot. So that's kind of the story. But what you also find from there is like there continues out from that to have to continually be strategies of pushing back against these pressures. And so it doesn't really alleviate this like systemic transformation. It just alleviates an immediate attack type thing. And so there's basic applications, but then, so one of the things though that I kind of wanted to talk about, so I wanted to, I guess, like kind of go over the story to also like validate some of like the basic ideas of it. But on one level though, it also can tend to be used as continuing this split between, like an improper split between like good and evil, and just seeing like just seeing it like that. There is a sense where, so like this Haman character, there is a sense where, so what's interesting about it is there's like a partial truth to what he's saying, is that he recognizes that he can kind of, like he recognizes that certain ones are not complying with the leadership, like Mordecai. And so because there's these historical tensions between, because he has some type of proximity to various ones that were associated with the divided kingdom, it kind of comes across as like he's not, he wasn't, you may or may not say he's like directly associated with the other oppositional side, but he seems in somewhat association with it. Like he had created relations with the other oppositional side, seemingly. Because if you read in the books of Josephus, a different historian in relation to scripture, there's this portion where it talks about the divided kingdom and different ones in association with the Samaritans, different ones forming alliances. And it seems that those in relation to this character had some kind of ties to that. So there was some kind of association to these different sides of the divided kingdom. So, and also just like ties to other historical tensions in relation to Israel. So you kind of realize it doesn't just come out of nowhere. Like it doesn't seem like he's just this guy that decided like, hey, I see this person not fully complying with allegiance to the system, I'm going to tattle on him and then get them all in trouble, or whatever, because this is like a threat to the king. So there's a little bit of truth there, because ultimately the movement of like this little glimmer of this path of God does ultimately have within it, ingrained in it, because it's like a nucleus of this like larger movement. It is a part of like what he had seen in the past when it generates in a different way, like in a positive way. It seeks to transform systems and kingdoms. And so there is truth when he's saying to the king, like kind of tattling on him, like you can't let this go, because these types of movements are a risk to kingdoms. So there's a little bit of truth to that. But the thing is like the risk to a kingdom is to like help partner in liberating it. And if a kingdom just wants sole power, like its own sole power unto itself, that would be a threat to a kingdom. Because a transformative approach means that a kingdom wouldn't have that same type of power. So there is truth to that. Like the movement of God is transformative and a threat to kingdoms. But at that point, like Mordecai wouldn't be a threat to a kingdom because he's forced to have to work with them internally, transforming it from within. And when there are the references of saying it's a threat to kingdoms is when in the past, when Israel had both a kingdom opposition, like warfare, and internal like transformative approach. But they're not at that phase now. They don't have the temple, and they don't have like a king to go to war. And so it's almost like they're saying, hey, don't let this go, because they'll redevelop into that imagery and be a threat to the kingdom. But the thing is, in the longer story, it's not supposed to be a threat to kingdoms as like warring. It's supposed to be an internal transformative mechanism that transforms kingdoms, working with them internally. And so there is some truth to what the claims of Haman are, is that he's recounting historical conflicts of warfare and things like that in association with this type of coinciding it with the spiritual movement. And so on that sense, there is some truth to that, that type of regenerating shouldn't occur. And so then, though, it kind of forces Mordecai and Esther to strategize internally and vulnerably with the kingdoms. But on another note, what you also find is like the world powers are vulnerable, and those that start to recognize the power they don't really have, actually on a kingdom level, if groups are more situated to strategize with them to alleviate improper power, it actually is a service to the kings, because they don't really have power. They're trapped in these like really toxic, forced pressure points of corrupt power, even unto themselves, even within their own council and stuff like that. So ultimately, if it was functioning in its more spiritual approach, working internally with a better standard to not function in a corrupt way, it's a good service to kings. So anyway, the point there is that Haman wasn't actually entirely wrong in his warning. And at the time, Israel wasn't just wanting to regenerate just through the temple. They were still imagining becoming a powerful kingdom to overthrow kingdoms. I'm not saying Mordecai or Esther did, but it was still kind of within some of the psyche still of their approach on the world stage. So there is some truth to that. But what also is interesting too, in like panning out from the story and trying to look at it like so if you're just looking at it as someone stuck in these conditions, there is like a triumphant stage of it, like you could, it is useful, because there's times in our growth, just our development, where we are stuck in conditions that we can't change, and there is a stage of our personal development on along the lines of spirituality, that there are stories similar like that we personally take on. But if you kind of follow the mystic teachings and the things that go even farther, where they challenge you to say, okay, now look back on these areas of triumph and growth, and then look back and peel back even more layers as to what transforms that situation even more, to have even prevented it, or just looking at it even more transformative. That's a different level of challenge. And so if we revisit that story and look at what are the points of reference that can be peeled back even more. And so I did talk about that, like how Haman actually wasn't entirely all wrong. He has like an accusatory approach that there's some truth to it, because Israel needs to be even further refined, and they're still seeking to survive and regenerate in a similar form. And so what he does is he puts pressure on them to make them have to negotiate internally with kings and develop those relationships. And so, yeah, there is some truth to what he was saying. And if you go even farther and you even look at like what was going on in scripture that led him to that position of opposition, and you look in the book of like the works of Josephus, there were stages where when Israel, the opposition, was seeking to negotiate and come to the table with the kings and collaborate, that some of the other side that Mordecai and various ones seem represented with not really Mordecai himself. He's just this like more of an isolated character. But just in general, like the entities that are trying to regenerate that eventually then are starting to rebuild the temple and whatnot. And then there's still these other characters like Sanballat and different ones that are kind of Sanballat. So when they do start rebuilding the temple after they develop these internal relationships with the kings, and they have to strategize with them for like a mutual form of like benefit, then they also develop this favor within various kings to start redeveloping their temple. But they're still pushing these other characters back. So there's another almost like Haman character that develops later on in the book of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah is starting to help rebuild the walls, and it's these stories of rebuilding, and they have to like, they're resisting Sanballat and different ones. And this is where you find Sanballat and these characters associated with the other side of opposition to Israel, like the other side of Israel. And they're still deeming them as not a part of them, like still their enemies. So what you also find is that you're seeing the story of them still developing through having an enemy. And what's interesting about that is it does portray, so when you're looking at this kind of thread of spiritual growth, it does portray certain stages that people tend to go through. Like our tendency is to look at like us in this character of this unresolved historical tensions we find ourselves in, and the things we have to do. And there's legitimacy to that. Like sometimes that's the situation you're in, and you're pushing back against these other tensions, and they're historical tensions that you feel like you didn't generate, or you're just like a part of, and you're continuing and preserving what you're trying to do as you have these other tensions. But if you go even farther, because this is what Jesus eventually does, because Jesus then is kind of a character that goes into more of like the mystic stage, pulling back the need for like the developed enemies, and then looking at what spirituality is. So in those stages that he goes even farther in this and tries to remedy, resolve like the temple and resolve this issue with these divided factions, which is when he goes and talks to the Samaritan woman, which even the disciples at his time, even though the disciples at his time that are attracted to Jesus and surrounding him are like, yeah, let's continue in this movement. It's been this long movement through warfare, through Esther, through Nehemiah, through negotiating with the kings and building our temple. And they're just kind of still seeing them as on this side of it. And so at the time of Jesus, their issue is to become even more free from the administration and the kings at the time, or like the governing officials, but still unto their side, like their side of things. So when Jesus goes even farther and is more transformative and says like, let's like reaches out to the Samaritans, they're just kind of like, what are you doing? Those like, this is our movement, that kind of thing. And so he does talk to them and draws them into this movement through the Samaritan woman and whatnot, and resolve some of that historical divide. And so what's interesting about that, though, is like you start to find that some of the continual generated pressure of their opposition, they were likely involved in too. And so like some of the tension they had taken on themselves that also associated with preserving their spiritual transformative ideology included them having this certain enemy. And they continued that idea even at the time of Jesus, then Jesus is pulling that back and saying, all right, now we need to go even farther into what spiritual transformation is, and challenge this idea of you and in like how you're creating this identity through the temple and this enemy on the world stage. And so you also find that they, in keeping and preserving the temple, which was needed as a strategy to transform the world powers and kings, to keep them going to preserve the temple, they kind of needed that. Like they used that enemy, they kind of pushed off from that enemy. Like they created an identity of we're doing this because they're not, like they're apostates and we're preserving this, like this vein of like who we are. And it is kind of interesting when you think about it like that. Like, would they have persisted even farther if they kind of didn't have that generated tension? It's hard to say, but anyway, what you find though is there were times where the groups were appealing to them to negotiate, and were showing them. So like in the book of Josephus, when they're going to negotiate with one of the like overseers, kings, what have you, the other group is trying to come in and negotiate with them, the other side, the oppositional side of Israel. And it was like the lingering groups that some of them had been absorbed and pushed out into like other places, but some of them were trying to come in and negotiate, and they wouldn't let them. And they had told the king something to the effect of like, don't let them come to the collaborative table. Those are like part of our historic enemies, and they keep trying to appeal to us and say they are a part of Israel, but they're not. And then it goes into this conversation as to, well, how are they a part of Israel? And they're like, well, they try to say they're a part of like the line of Joseph, and they're part of like the apostate Israel, and like, we're the remnant, And so what you find though is that they actually are legitimate portions of Israel if there was like rebuilding. And at the time when there's opportunities to rebuild, because they even say like, well, they know that we have this opportunity to rebuild and are developing negotiations, and they just want to have a part of it, but they're not a part of it. The thing is like they actually are a part of it, and there should be the ability for them to come together and develop and regenerate, but they just keep pushing them out. And so they just keep this like in-group, out-group. And part of that is what generates that perpetual tension. And so they rebuild with this like perpetual tension. And then that's what Jesus kind of brings out later, when he kind of shifts things to go even farther into the transformative stages of things. And it's probably also why it becomes really controversial, because they had developed a type of identity through preservation of the temple and some of these things, and with having this enemy. And then Jesus kind of transforms a lot of those things, where he reveals like, well, the spirit of the mechanism of the temple can transition to, the whole language of him, like he is the temple, we are the temple. And then he de-escalates his tension between their like rival enemies. And through that then ushers in this like a transformative approach to a type of person that you become as you interact with other people, and this kind of like more spiritually freed version of not having to adhere to some of these certain approaches to the temple, and these different conflicts. So he just really transforms a lot of that, and then that becomes something that's even more able to be free to negotiate, because at that time there was a lot of gridlock in how the temple establishment in relation to these other enemies and managing these groups in relation to the governing system was just in gridlock, and it was being more weaponized. And so there wasn't really like a relief of mechanism of leadership, there were another reemergence of like certain societal pressure points and strategies. And so it wasn't functioning in just the flow of business and whatnot. It was very much weaponized against different, it was being used to be weaponized against other people groups. So Jesus was kind of dismantling it needing to be used like that. And so he became a felt threat to various ones. There's more that goes on with like what Jesus was doing. But my main point in this story is that even though in the midst of, say, like the story of Esther and Mordecai, you can look at them as overcoming that portion of preservation for something that did need to be preserved as like the story goes. But you also see it as a stage where later even more of those things could be alleviated. And it's like another example where even though in the midst of like where people find themselves, they can say these people, these groups, these historical tensions are legitimately coming at us and animated toward us and getting at us and picking at us and doing these things. It's kind of a story where it could say there's legitimacy to that situation. But what's even more transformative is looking into why has it intersected? What historically developed it like that? And what's even more transformative about these different roles of these different characters? And so it's another example of like, how do you diminish the improper in-group, out-group of these sides that generate these tensions? What were other opportunities? How is the system being used to regenerate those divides against people? And then also, in the midst of it, how do you alleviate and work internally through people groups to alleviate improper pressures on the king's leadership as well? And so it was like solving all of those like social dynamics. Because, and I think what's good to address there is that this stage of survival for them and negotiating still kept a slanted one-sided preference of things. And so and then it also revealed that it never really was safety. It didn't really alleviate the issue. It just continued to have to be strategized like that. And so it's this story of going even farther as like what negotiates on behalf of the different sides to actually alleviate those tensions. So what you also find, and this is probably applicable today, is that it would be idealistic to say, well, just let all the different sides have some benefit, There is something to that. Like there is a sense of looking at like what are certain needs that the governing officials should meet on behalf of the people to alleviate pressures and da-da-da-da. There is that. But I think if you're looking at it where religious groups oppose and they say that's not really the deal that needs to be made, the question, maybe on a religious angle would be, okay, if we are going to try to resolve things to meet the needs of the different sides, the religious question that's being asked is, how do we preserve the spiritual transformative distinction to still be set in motion as we make these agreements? So for instance, the transformative aspect that's trying to be preserved in the story of Mordecai and Esther is they're preserving the spiritual distinction so as to not improperly adhere to everything the king says, because that's like a product of him being pressured on a political forces to not even be free unto himself. And so the vulnerable negotiation there was to alleviate those pressure points so that the king can make more clear, transparent decisions. The people aren't the byproduct of the tension that on them to comply with things because the king's not free and the people aren't free and there's not really freedom. So what you don't want is to produce just getting everyone to comply in the same type of way, but you also don't want just resistance to where there's no vision for anything being transformative and just switching powers around. And so this is kind of an example where I think people get confused, where they're trying to preserve, like in religious groups, they're trying to preserve what that transformative aspect is that results in freedoms for people that kind of set in motion a transformative spiritual value, and also freedom from improper control of kings that take the place of God. But what you find is people get confused about that, and they kind of become like in this like religious dogmatism where they think that they're preserving that spiritual transformative distinction just by fighting these other enemies and coming up with reasons why they have these other enemies, and then thinking that as long as they have a seat at the table with the kings that they're resolving that. But if they don't really have a spiritual distinction, what you find is that they can easily become the very version of the king to the improper council that produced the improper effect on the population. And that's what you find at Jesus's time, is they think, some of the establishment think they've developed for themselves the seat at the table among the kings or the powers, and that they're enforcing control over the population. And Jesus comes in and says, no, that's not the transformative value. You turned in the spiritual value, transformative aspect, into you just being in control over other people, because now you've religified the idea that you're putting pressure on your enemies. And so he's like pulling all of that out and returning to the question of what's the transformative approach. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that because there's things to think about along the lines of that story. And yeah, anyway.